now my great pleasure to introduce Adjunct Professor Fiona Foley, who will in turn introduce the planned installation for Courting Blackness. Fiona is the curator of the Courting Blackness project and is an artist with an established national and international reputation for developing innovative public art projects and a wide range of other genres over several decades. Her capacity to manage projects and mentor artists is proven in her success in previous collaborations with artists in different institutional contexts, including universities. Her curatorial vision is to develop artworks that speak to important tensions within the concept of nationhood and unresolved sovereignty. To this end, she has selected artists for this project whose work invites different interpretations of what it means to be Australian. Please welcome Adjunct Professor Fiona Foley.
What I want to start off with is a quote by Socrates. I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. So that's what I'm doing with this project, Courting Blackness. I'm only making you think. I cannot teach you anything. I've been an adjunct professor before at Griffith University, and I did a project there called The Art of Politics, the Politics of Art, and there was a 2-day conference in association with that particular project. And I like these interventions that we have at these learned institutions. So this was a project, a photographic series. My guys are called the HHH, the Hedonistic Honky Haters, obviously based on other constructs of power that we're very familiar with. You would be very familiar with, known as the KKK. And you know, the question that I have is that, like, what happens when you subvert constructs of power? And I think the Great Court is a construct of power. And I think by subverting that space, we actually create a more interesting space. So the work that's going to be positioned there through Ryan and Archie and the other 5 artists is actually going to be a much more interesting space than it has currently been, because we're going to have it enter into a new type of dialogue that we have never done before. Thank you.
Archie Moore is a Queensland artist who has participated in individual and group exhibitions in Australia, Japan, UK, USA, France and New Caledonia. He has received awards for his portrait and sculpture work and completed major public art commissions in Brisbane and other major centres. So please welcome Archie. Thank you.
Hello everyone. When I was asked to be involved in the project, it had the working title of Interventions, I think. And when we had a bit of a tour around the Great Court, I saw this pathway that divides the Great Court into. And then I noticed there's like 5 light poles, which made me think of flagpoles. So then I've done work referencing the Australian Aboriginal flag before, and I thought I could relate back to that again. And I was thinking about how some people say, Aboriginal people will say the Australian flag is divisive because how it excludes reference to Aboriginal people in the flag. And then also when Paul Keating gave the Aboriginal flag status of a flag of Australia, John Howard was opposing that and said that was divisive as well. So I started thinking about doing a flag of every nation in Australia, every Aboriginal nation, just to highlight the point that there were other nations here, and whether that's a right idea or not, I'm not too sure yet. But I started reading a bit about R.H. Matthews as an early person, surveyor and anthropologist, who saw these groups as nations. Putting these flags in this, using these flagpoles, is a sort of intervention into the Great Court, and will create a visual dialogue with the university building, and also with the flags that are raised above the Forgan Smith Tower, which is the Aboriginal flag, Torres Strait, Queensland flag, and the university flag. And the flag as a potential site to look at intersections between history, power relationships, constructs of identity, people and place. I'm also interested in the flag being a symbol of conquering a space. It's like planting the flag, saying, this is my area now. And also how many instances there are of that, like the moon landing and Russia putting their own flag at the Arctic seabed. So, and also there was this year there was a republic, Marawari Republic, declared in New South Wales and part of Queensland. It's an Aboriginal group that seceding, claiming their own space, and they have their own flag as well. I'm going to show you earlier work I did in 2012 at the Commercial Gallery in Sydney. Had a solo exhibition looking at the Aboriginal flag. And this one I made just to say that Aboriginal people aren't one-dimensional people. They're not, everyone's different. And I sort of had 10 designs that would identify Aboriginal people, whether they have a right-wing, left-wing ideology, anarchists, gay, Christian Aboriginals, and one is a coconut as well, which I did the Aboriginal flag in red, white and blue to represent those Aboriginal people that may not want to belong. Another work from 2012 where I've broken the Aboriginal flag down into three components. And these are all just acrylic paint. I called them acrylic paint on nothing. And I just painted on a piece of rubber and peeled it off and hung it on the wall. And I just think about nationhood, the concept of a nation. What does that mean? Did Indigenous people have this idea of nationhood? Is that a later evangelical invention introduced by anthropologists, maybe to arrange Indigenous people into groups to impose some sort of colonial order upon them? And how nationhood can be an intervention into people's lives as well. That's it.
I'd now like to introduce another participating artist in the Courting Blackness project. Ryan Presley is a Marina artist from Alice Springs and is presently based in Queensland. Ryan's work has been represented in 3 solo exhibitions and numerous group exhibitions across the country. His work is also represented in the collections of the UQ Art Museum and the Anthropology Department, Anthropology Museum here at UQ, Griffith Artworks, Murdoch University Art Collection, as well as other international and private collections. So please welcome Ryan. Thank you.
So I'm originally from Alice Springs. My family's Marangara Martha Wayyak Kungabal people from Moyle River country in Northern Territory. And my mother's families are immigrants, recent immigrants from Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark. I sort of like to go from my own background and look at the country around me. So like my grandfather was abducted as a young child and used as a slave labour on the stock routes, cattle stations and stuff in Northern Territory. And like 11 years old doing adult work for nothing. And so that sort of history sort of spurns me on and looks at, wants me to look at like these myths of nationhood and interpretations of history. I was looking at with the Q150 just a few years ago, talking about that heritage and 150 years, like sort of with all the advertising and stuff, sort of building itself up to be like this real achievement or such a long time. So I started working on a body of work I call Dog Years, because maybe they're thinking of it as 150 years, what's that in times by 7? Then maybe that's getting a little longer. And so with this plate sort of looking at those recollections and using introduced species as like ambassadors or totems of colonial conquest. So I've got the fox there sort of piercing the country, and that through teachings like primary school and stuff, how you learn about this wondrous first fleet and that recollection. And over this sort of, these plates, this series, the Southern Cross is used and sort of evolves along. With the last plate is in its current sort of trend. And with the Indian minor birds, I found out Indian minor birds like take other birds out of their nests and then use their nest. So we'll kill other birds' eggs and chicks. So I'll just talk about the blood money mostly for this talk, because that's what Fiona approached me about, using this sort of concept for the Courting Blackness project. So I was thinking about money a few years ago, and I was interested in these polymer sheets or paper sheets and coins that have such intricate designs and are very thoroughly constructed, and how these work within society to separate people or distinguish people. And then looking also at like who's on the notes and how that's used for whatever purpose. So I started researching about the people on the notes. I think this one was Mary Gilmore off the top of my head. And then finding like parallels within the last few years of history and stuff. So with like Mary Gilmore, I think she was like came here as a prisoner, but then became a very wealthy businesswoman. And so using Wallia as a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman, who sort of faced opposite life trajectory from colonialism, and but still stood and fought against invading forces. And then with like the designs and colours of the notes as well, I thought they were, struck me a lot as Aboriginal designs, or at least very influenced. I didn't think that they were genuinely representing like a European tradition, or that these sort of colours and combinations reflected European symbolism a lot of the time. So by redoing these notes and replacing Aboriginal people back into them, like just obviously with the concentric circle sort of designs, it was sort of reclaiming that wealth and cultural heritage, and then putting in things like the Black Line in Tasmania that they did, and remembering these things that have happened, like Fiona was talking about the massacres. Vincent Ngari with the Gurindji's people's strike. And it's sort of one of the things I want to do with this note is how in that story they constantly rejected financial compensation, however petty it was, and they kept staying strong for their objective and achieve that objective for that time being at least. And then sort of with that photo of getting the sand back in his hand, sort of twisting that instead of being like the recipient. I just was interested in the body language of that shot and twisting it around. So with that raised fist, it's sort of, I don't know if you can see in the slide, but it's got dust coming out of it, so it's like not receiving, but it's a more powerful pose, you know. With Jandamara in Western Australia, and I was looking at the designs in this as well, and I was talking to a friend about it who had spent time in the military, in Defence Force and that, and they were saying a lot of the symbols in this note that are on the note now, one in particular on the right-hand side, is like a Defence Force symbol, but it was part of this note, which was, I can't remember who's on it off the top of my head, someone who wasn't involved in the Defence Force, but to get that on the note, there'd have to be some levels of permission or working with within that different roles of government. So I thought that was interesting as well, how these layers come into these banknotes, and then replacing that with sort of country designs, like mountainous designs, giving Jandamara that home team advantage that he had, and strength. Fanny Balbach in the Perth area was someone who's very strident about maintaining important pathways and routes and dreaming stories and stuff in the Perth area that was being heavily industrialised, going as far to smash through fences and call out people on what they were doing and how they're intruding in the space, and to smash through, break through those barriers to continue her important pathways into areas of importance. And then looking at the opera singer that's on the $100 bill and finding that comparison with Gladys Tabingumpa, with her roles in maintaining song and dance for her country, and with the native title win and stuff, and her subsequent celebration. And then with the nationalism as well, looking how that's maintained. So yeah, looking at the hierarchies and how they're maintained in this country. Police as sharks, just because the way I saw them, like they sort of cruise around, sniffing for trouble and stuff. It just reminded me how sharks cruise around the ocean. Like with the chains can be used to oppress people, but on the flip side of that, someone's given an advantage. So with sharks and these seas of chains, they're not denying them anything. They're prospering from that. So they're sort of like networks of power, and with the good cop, bad cop blended into each other, that violence as a means to an end, and that acceptance of violence, with the policeman Hurley, obviously maliciously beating someone and then given a free pass essentially. And then I was working on the banknotes further for the last year or two, and feeling that I'd sort of missed the mark somewhat in developing them. Like they still had that 50, 20, 100 hierarchy, quantifiable, sort of cultural outlook. So what to me was a more appropriate cultural outlook was an infinite dollar, something that wasn't compatible with that Western system of exchange. And if it was to be used, would totally sort of render defunct financial system. And I think that's what a general term of Aboriginal cultures across the country is. In cultural outlook, it's incompatible with particularly financial systems. And then with this one I did in 2012, continuing with a son of someone I'd done a note with in the year before, so sort of showing that these people don't operate in a vacuum, that they had offspring and people that continued their struggles onwards. And then sort of we're looking at, for this project, doing large block letters, sort of like, I guess, that Commonwealth Bank had. That was on the other year in the courtyard, because a lot of the work, I think, is going up around the building, so I thought making these big block letters to go in the actual grasslands area. And putting, in some fashion, with adhesives or screen printing, the notes sort of flowing across the different letters, with a sort of punish, change idea. Yeah, so that's sort of my input into this project.